Hello, I'm Dr. Louise, and this is Dr. Louise Thinks, a channel dedicated to helping everyday folks connect with the healing power of philosophy. This week, I've been thinking a lot about hope. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, if you haven't noticed, and a non-trivial chunk of it is pretty big and heavy. I'm wondering, what role does hope play in our reactions to all this big stuff going on? In fact, I've been thinking so much about this that I want to do a series here on the channel all about hope. So if that's interesting to you, be sure to subscribe. Now, typically when we think about hope, at least here in the West, it's seen as a good thing, something that we should strive for, even when the odds are stacked against us. But, as always, it is good to question whether the default assumptions our culture hands us are actually true. Now, Pema Chödrön is an American-born Tibetan Buddhist nun. She is one of my favorite teachers. In my course on practical philosophy, we actually read her book, When Things Fall Apart: Heart Advice for Difficult Times. That course was a little while ago, but as I was processing everything that's happened recently, I instinctively reached for this book. Specifically, I found myself rereading the chapter called Hopelessness and Death. And let me tell you, this time around when I read this chapter, I found a lot of interesting things. Now, of course, I'd read this part of the text before, but like I found with other philosophical texts, how much something really impacts you or resonates with you depends a lot on where you are in your life and kind of where the world is. So unlike these traditionally positive conceptions of hope, Pema Chödrön argues that hopelessness is actually a good thing. Her idea is that hopelessness can ease our suffering much more effectively than if we try to lean into the idea of fostering hope. So, I don't know about you, but the first time I heard this idea, I reacted very strongly to it. You know those moments where you're like reading quietly, and I was in a coffee shop actually when I was doing this. So I'm reading quietly, and you have this really strong instinct to suddenly start like yelling at the book and disturbing everybody around you. That's how I was feeling when I visited this idea again. Surely hopelessness cannot be a good thing, right? Like, aren't we taught that we ought to be hopeful? Now, I've studied Buddhist philosophy a decent amount in my life, but Pema Chödrön's particular way of articulating this is not very common in the literature that I've worked in, and it really does capture something very interesting that most Buddhist stuff is not quite hitting the same way. But the more I started reading Pema's ideas and really kind of resonating, digging into the chapter, thinking harder about it, the more these ideas started to make sense to me. See, Pema argues that hope is actually something that distracts us. In fact, she goes so far as to say we have an addiction to hope in our society. We're all addicted to hope. Hope that the doubt and mystery will go away. This addiction has a painful effect on society. A society based on lots of people addicted to getting ground under their feet is not a very compassionate place. Whenever we start to experience something uncomfortable, we have this hope that maybe it could be different. And so we go about trying to change stuff so that we don't have to be uncomfortable. And while it is true that everything is always changing, at least on the Buddhist picture, it is also true that no matter what changes occur, it is very unlikely we are going to get to a place where we have no discomfort whatsoever. According to Pema, we waste a lot of energy and time focusing on trying to escape from this discomfort by redirecting ourselves to create change. Because there is no way to create a permanent state of being comfortable, this project's in vain. Even if you can temporarily make yourself more comfortable, you really aren't going to be able to get to the kind of reality you're trying to move toward. So in this view, hope is in tension with our ability to stay in the present moment. If you've heard much of anything about Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, you probably have heard of the concept of mindfulness and the general goal to try to stay in the present moment. Pema thinks because hope is necessarily oriented towards future change, it is distracting you and making it difficult for you to stay in the present. And when we leave the present moment, we suffer. If we can stay in the present and we can give up this idea of hoping that some point in the future will be better, we can actually be much more fully in the present moment. If in this moment we are experiencing discomfort, we can come to truly understand that discomfort. We can examine it, we can feel it, we can observe it, we can notice how it's arising in our bodies. We can take a good, hard, serious look at this discomfort. And according to Pema, this is the more compassionate thing to do. In fact, this is the more brave option for us. She says that this really is what confidence looks like. Rather than running away from the discomfort and trying to change that reality, we confront it directly. We stop ourselves, we look at the discomfort, we come to know it and understand it. And we come to realize that this discomfort is a part of us. It is a part of our experience. And it is not something that we can successfully run away from. She says, quote, "Suffering begins to dissolve when we can question the belief or the hope that there is anywhere to hide." One thing I thought was quite interesting in the way she makes this point is her discussion of the relationship between hope and fear. To make this point, she appeals to the Tibetan language. The Tibetan word for hope is rewa. Forgive my pronunciation, my Tibetan's a little rusty. And the word for fear is dokpa. Typically they are combined to the word redok. And redok just means hope and fear. These ideas are closely aligned in the Tibetan language. And Pema suggests that it's not just the language, it's not just a quirk of the words, but in reality, whenever there is hope, there is also fear. These two things are very closely aligned in Pema's view. She goes on in the chapter to talk about how hope is connected to our general, prominent in our lives, fear of death. She appeals to a talk given by Trungpa Rinpoche titled Death in Everyday Life. Here, Trungpa points out that in our culture, we come to fear death and to try to escape from it. Here he points out that in our culture, we fear death, but at the very same time, we experience death every single day. It's not just about when loved ones pass from this earth, but it's when we experience disappointments, or our plans just don't work out, or we experience change. Whenever we're experiencing the stuff that we don't really want, that is to experience death. Now, according to Pema, death and hopelessness can really help us be motivated for living an insightful and compassionate life. But here we are, we're so desperately trying to ward off death and ward off hopelessness. We're really doing ourselves a disservice in this practice. Instead, what we should try to do is relax. We need to relax into the present moment. We need to relax with the reality of death. We need to relax into our hopelessness. This is what's going to help us stop all of these shenanigans to try to stop change and stop death and to stop this future-oriented thing that's happening when we hope. I love this particular passage from the end of the chapter. Giving up hope is encouragement to stick with yourself, to make friends with yourself, to not run away from yourself, to return to the bare bones, no matter what's going on. Fear of death is the background of the whole thing. It's why we feel restless, why we panic, why there's anxiety. But if we totally experience hopelessness, giving up all hope of alternatives to the present moment, we can have a joyful relationship with our lives, an honest, direct relationship one that no longer ignores the reality of impermanence and death. Pema Chödrön actually recommends that we write "abandon hope" on our fridge so that we have to look at it and think about it on a regular basis. This is an invitation to regularly reflect on the fact that we need to face our fears. We need to face the reality of change. We need to face the fact that sometimes we are uncomfortable and we need to become friends with that fact. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so if I embrace hopelessness, isn't that going to demotivate me from doing anything good at all? Like, what's the point of doing all this stuff if it's just embracing being hopeless? Isn't the point of hope to give me a reason to try to change the world for the better? One way to understand this is that hopelessness, at least in the Western world, is often seen of as a negative thing. Something that is necessarily connected to despair and giving up. The picture that Pema is painting for us suggests that this is not the case. Hopelessness enables us to live more fully and more joyfully in the present moment. And when we take a look at the work that Pema Chödrön is doing in the world, it certainly doesn't seem that her commitment to hopelessness necessarily means we shouldn't try to bring about positive change. The Pema Chödrön Foundation was created in 2006. It has several major projects that are all dedicated toward creating positive change in the world. A few of the noteworthy projects include the Malezi School in Nairobi, Kenya, which is the first school in the community to actually provide affordable education as well as necessary nutrition for all the students that attend. Another project is the Homebody Industries in Los Angeles. This program helps former gang members and folks who were formerly incarcerated become contributing members to their community. And the foundation is involved in several other projects that are more directly tied to serving Buddhism-oriented communities. If Pema Chödrön was hopeless in the despair sort of way, surely she would not have dedicated so much to these projects that are oriented towards creating positive change. This invites us to consider the possibility that we can simultaneously embrace hopelessness without giving in to despair. We can be hopeless and still move towards a brighter future. And we can do this without having to respond to every moment of discomfort by escaping into the hope that something better might be out there. Now, having said all of that, it might be too hard to accept a vision of the world that means our goal state, what we're trying to do is to get everybody to be hopeless. Pema Chödrön's view here is fascinating. I think it's really interesting. It has a lot of value, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm wholesale on board with it. It is comforting to me in those moments where I am feeling hopeless that maybe it's not such a bad thing to feel like that. Maybe there is value and goodness in that experience. But it starts to feel weirder to me when I think about, okay, the goal state is for everyone to feel like this. That doesn't quite track for me. In our next episode in this Hope series, we're going to start our exploration of Katie Stockdale's Hope Under Oppression. In this book, she explores what it means for people to be hopeful in situations where they are actively being oppressed, and what this can teach us about what hope in general really is. If that sounds interesting to you and you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And until next time, stay curious, be thoughtful, and keep asking those questions. Bye-bye.